and bring the power of your mind and the power of your understanding, the power of your knowledge as an offering to a suffering world.
Robert Moore exposes a global epidemic of grandiosity, unchecked narcissism and violence tearing us apart. From a shattering moment in Mumbai to a worldwide crisis, this is a raw look at how rising anxiety breaks down our personal and cultural systems. The old spiritual containers are collapsing, fueling chaos, addiction and aggression. But there's a way forward, building inner strength and compassionate fellowship to weather the flood. Stay with us to uncover the truth behind the chaos and the path to resilience. This lecture is titled The Flood, Facing the Growing Epidemic of Grandiosity, Part 1 of the conference, Coping with Grandiosity in Our Lives, the Deity and the Dragon Inside Us, recorded in 2014 in San Antonio, Texas.
Well, I thank you for taking the time to be here, and I'm going to say again, I really appreciate your giving me this opportunity to see if I can think again. So I really appreciate your opening up this space and spending a little time with me. And if I have last night broken any circuit breakers, I apologize. Just remember to keep a good sense of humor. There's an old saying in some parts of the South where they say, whenever you're listening to me, make sure you're taking it all with a 100-pound sack of salt. In other words, I may not understand what I'm talking about tonight, but I'm going to make some offerings anyway. So tonight, I told you that I was going to take off my psychoanalytic scientist hat and that I'm going to talk about, I think, the most important thing that has brought us here together, and that is the real spiritual center that we need to be trying to ground ourselves within our lives. As you remember, I said last night, psychology is useful and helpful as far as it goes. And tonight, we want to focus on walking your spiritual path. And what I'm going to do is just share some things that have been coming to me. You know, Jung believed in the possibility of living what he called a synchronistic life. For Christians, we would say that you follow the leadings of providence as they slowly open out. And you try to pay attention to the signs that may help you discern your path. Some of you told me that you'd been studying the discernment of the spirits. Well, that's kind of where we're going to go tonight. We talked about all the psychological take on what is possible in the possible psyche. Tonight, I'd like to just share with you some reflections on what I believe is really possible for us spiritually. You know, there are a lot of folk who set their sights really low in spiritual life. But Jung sort of opened up a space for people to think about that individuation thing, which is not minimalist. You know, it's not some kind of arbitrary cutting off of where you could possibly go. And for Jung, you know, he had to be a closet mystic for many years, because if he hadn't been a closet mystic, he would have been totally dismissed as a scientist. In truth, he was always grounded in his own mystical experience. So I just want to share with you a few synchronicities that you all experience synchronicities, meaningful coincidences, things that come to you that you did not invite, but that seem to bring some sort of illumination with them. Here lately, I have been really kind of fascinated to notice how many Buddhists have been showing up for me to work with. And I hadn't really had much to do with Buddhism in a long time. In my younger days, I was privileged to actually teach comparative religions for quite some time. I taught Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and so on. But I'd been out of touch with that for a long time. I'd sort of even forgotten that back in 1992, I edited a volume on Buddhism and Jung called The Self and Liberation. And what I'd done is I had sought out and brought together all of the really good essays that we could find anywhere that were the best essays relating Jung to Buddhism. And I hadn't thought about that book probably in 20, 25 years, something like that. This Jungian analyst calls me up and he says, "Robert, I'm writing a book on the ox herding pictures that were a chapter in the book you published back in 1992. I said, "Oh, really?" So I started looking. So he asked me, "Would you talk with me about the ox herding pictures?" I said, "Well, you'll have to let me find my book and read that again. I don't remember anything about it." So what the ox herding pictures are a series of images which are sort of one of the Buddhist versions of that diagram of the path toward individuation that I was talking to you about last night. So these pictures depict the Buddhist understanding of the stages of the path toward enlightenment. So I got that out, and this was before these Tibetan Buddhists started showing up. So I looked at that thing on the ox herding pictures. If you haven't ever seen them, you ought to find an old copy of that and check them out. They're very fascinating in the light of what we're talking about tonight. Anyway, so I told him yes, after I reviewed that, I would be happy to sit down with him and talk to him about it. So as I'm trying to review what was in this book, I start getting these calls from these folks that want to do some analysis with me who happen to be Tibetan Buddhist. And I was puzzled by that, all this, suddenly they all come up together. That's what happens in synchronicity. So as I'm trying to find out something about the world of these young people, I say young, they're in their 40s, that's really young, as you know. And so I began to ask for some resources to kind of update me a little bit on Tibetan Buddhism. And so I began to look at some of the major texts of what they call Kalachakra school of Dzogchen Tibetan Buddhism. It's sort of a Buddhist version of Catholic mysticism. It's really wild. And so I'm reading this stuff, and I'm trying to understand what these young Buddhists are talking about their experience and what their Lama tries to transmit to them. And so this is all very fascinating, and it's sort of new territory to me. And I start listening, and fascinating they start kind of teaching me what the Lama has been teaching them. The Lama is their guru of their tradition. What starts happening to me is I start really experiencing some fascination with a lot of their insights, which I was not aware that they had on the spiritual path. You know, not all Buddhists are alike. The Zen Buddhists are kind of like Presbyterian Buddhists. Calvinist. You know, simple. You know, no symbolism. You know. But the Tibetan Buddhists, I found out that they sort of go in and explore the collective unconscious. I thought, this is spooky. I mean, you know, they're doing, from their point of view, the same thing I've been trying to do from a Jungian point of view, mapping the collective unconscious. And they have been at this a long, long time. And it's quite fascinating. And as I start reading all this stuff, and you know, in my work, if you've been familiar with my work any over the last couple of decades, you know, I talk a lot about that diamond body, that crystalline structure in the psyche that Jung actually believed was the geometry of the archetypal self. Basically, in my work, I've just kind of picked up where Jung left off, and Jung was always trying to figure out what those facets of that octahedron were. I meant to bring you a calcium fluoride crystal and left it at home. Go to a lapidary here in town, if you got one. See if they got a calcium fluoride crystal. They're a naturally occurring octahedron. And that's the shape. That's in the exact geometrical shape that Jung thought was the shape of the archetypal self. So I had called that, I named that the diamond body. And as you notice, I mean, you may see in that catalog that I finally decided that a way to symbolize what I've been working on is decoding the diamond within, the diamond body, from a psychological point of view. Turns out that the particular Tibetan tradition that these young people are studying is the tradition that speaks the most about the diamond body that's in you. And that according to them, their spiritual path, the spiritual path really is all about, fancy this, it's all about becoming aware of the diamond within. And the path of optimizing your spiritual enlightenment and self-realization, they call the diamond path. The diamond path. And the way they think about what you really are trying to allow to emerge in your psyche, or to become more conscious of the reality in your soul, is they have this goal of having you become aware of this indestructible diamond reality in your soul. As you might guess, this kind of got my attention, right? So I began to try to understand what they talk about this diamond path. And synchronistically, these people began to just, in the sessions with me, they would begin to just, I would ask them a question about it, and they would just begin to teach. And I was amazed, you know, I mean. And so I just listened to them teach. And the thing that started happening was I began to have a lot of experience resonances with Christian understanding. I began to see, it sounds like these folks have been discovering a lot of the primal, fundamental spiritual reality that Christians have always talked about. And so, inevitably, I started to start thinking, looking at Scripture a little bit through their lens. You know, it's often helpful, and some of you have probably been active in the Christian Buddhist dialogue. I mean, I suspect some of you have. John Cobb, the great process theologian of Claremont, California, head of the Center for Process Studies. Cobb was this great Whiteheadian theologian, and who believed that the Christians and the Buddhists have a lot to teach each other, and that if they would bother to actually try to share insights, that both traditions would be enhanced and deepened. So I'm looking through this stuff that I'm not familiar with, and it occurs to me that it sounds like some biblical insights. And it sounds like some Christian mystical insights. And so as I think about that, I began to have some thoughts about ways to kind of rethink what actually might be set as a possible way of thinking about where we would like to go spiritually. I'm here tonight to simply say, I'm a little weird. I actually think you have these amazing potentials. And I'm here tonight to just say to you, it's been sort of made clear to me that we're shooting awfully low these days in terms of what's possible. You've heard people talk about settling in relationships. Seems to me that we settle a lot for, Ron was talking about this, about, how did you pronounce it? Accidia? Being a little spiritually lazy. So tonight I just want to lay out for you the things that have occurred to me that I might want to just lift up for us to think about tonight. In our version of trying to walk the diamond path to spiritual realization. So what is possible? Well, we could say, like some of the Native Americans, it's possible to learn to walk in the beauty way. That's one way to say it. It's possible to learn to walk in the beauty way. It's possible to move toward an elegant and radiant integration and coherence of psyche and spirit. That's really possible. It's not just a fantasy, an unrealistic pipe dream. And here's what the Tibetan Buddhists talk about a lot. And now listen to this now with your Christian ear. They talk about how primally close to you this radiant, abundant, big love of your inherent Buddha nature. I think that strikes, what they think is, they think that the most real thing about you right now, without any effort, without any long training in meditation, without any radical asceticism, without any radical renunciation. They think right now, behind your ego consciousness, you are sitting in this radical radiant compassion and love. They believe that in you, that I could look in your eyes and I can look right past your ego, and that in there, looking at me, is this what they call get this now, what they call the radiant awareness being. There's this eternally powerful, loving, compassionate, radiant being that is pure awareness. What does that remind you of? So one thing that they teach is that it is not only realistic for you to think about dwelling in the primal abundance and the big love. Now get this now. Not only is it realistic for you to aspire to that, they think you're already there. Let me repeat that. They think that at your most fundamental reality, the most real thing about you is already radically enlightened being. Now, what does that remind you of in terms of Christian mystics? So think about that a bit. I have a poem. I forgot. I'm always forgetting things these days. But if I had been a little less forgetful, I would have invited all of you to invoke your most significant spiritual mentors, to invoke their spirits to be with us tonight. And I know every one of you has got key saints, present and past saints, that have helped you on your way. And I want you to think about, just name them in your hearts, the ones that have been the most bright and shining sources of illumination for you on your journey already. I wish we had time. I would have you all just stand and say their name. I'm going to be talking about a couple of my saints here tonight. One I'm going to read you a poem of. And this is the great Sufi poet Rumi. If you have never heard Robert Bly and Coleman Barks offering the readings of Rumi poems together to music, that is an ecstatic thing. It's available. You should try to find those tapes. But here's Rumi, who obviously lived constantly conscious of the great friend. He called the great it the guest. The guest. Here's his poem called, and it's what we're talking about tonight, The Road Home. The Road Home. An ant hurries along a threshing floor with this little grain of wheat, moving between huge stacks, not knowing the abundance all around. It thinks its one grain is all there is to love. The ant and its one grain of wheat. So we choose a tiny seed to be devoted to. This body, one path, or one teacher. look wider and further, the essence of every human being can see. And what that essence I takes in, becomes Saturn or Solomon. The ocean pours through a jar, and you might say it swims inside the fish. The mystery gives peace to your longing and makes the road home. That is, he offers that primal insight a great deal of the time. It's a lot like what these Tibetan Buddhists teach. You're already swimming in the radiance. That's what Rumi believed. So anyway, so I began to give a lot of thought about that. And I was thinking about this in the light of this esoteric mystery that we've been thinking about, the mystery of the symbolism of the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the indestructible vessel. As I was preparing this, I was thinking about Jung's essays on the transformation symbolism in the Mass. And it became quite clear to me as I was reflecting on this that every time you participate in the Mass, you're really acting out the kind of truth about the indwelling of the sacred in a transformative way all the time. So our path, what's our path? Spiritual path. It's learning to love the dragon, the great it, the great other within. We said last night, psychologically, it's understanding and living the ego-archetypal self relationship. But spiritually, we could say it's actually learning to open to the love of the Great One. And according to these Tibetan Buddhists, we need to consider the possibility that we're already sitting in its radiance and love, and the big love they talk about now. We begin by acknowledging the reality that there is a great companion who understands. The hard part is actually beginning to open the conscious, respectful dialogue with the great it. I watched this for many years when people were doing active imagination with the archetypal self. It's very fascinating. The great it will often manifest in the early time of someone's learning active imagination. It will often manifest sort of like a shy child. It will not trust you at first. It won't believe that you're really serious about being aware of it. But if you're trustworthy and you're doing active imagination, or if you're trustworthy and when you're getting those special delivery letters from the great it, then it's interesting, it starts to trust you more. And the amazing thing is it starts to actually speed up what it wants to tell you. Ron was so on target earlier today when he was talking about the sort of the God press, the God pressure coming in. It acts as if it is in a hurry to get caught up with you. It's like it's eager to get caught up with you. And so, our end of this is to just kind of wake up into more trustworthiness, so that the great it starts to know that we respect it, that we're not going to take it for granted, that we're not going to cheapen it with a lack of seriousness. So there's a long period right there, and it takes different times for different people, that learning to build a relationship of trust. I used to remember Brother Lawrence. I decided after witnessing this stuff for a long time that Brother Lawrence was always right. Talked about the centrality of practicing the presence. Practicing the presence. That's what the diamond path is about. Just getting to the point where you have a clear, committed intention to not go to sleep and to practice the presence all the time. People have interesting ideas about prayer. They often will think they should pray 20 minutes a day, or maybe even 45 minutes a day. But when you get into this territory, it's really not about saying rote prayers or saying them at a particular time. It is the cultivation of an ongoing, dependable awareness that you are not alone, and that you try to remember to be really suspicious when you start feeling like you're alone. Let me repeat that. It's a good thing to start learning to be suspicious when you feel alone. Because according to what Jung believes and what I have seen evidence for from all sorts of sources, you're really not ever alone. And the idea, the sense of being alone, is really some kind of ego trickster phenomenon. In other words, if we're really feeling alone, we're back to Freud's idea that the ego is kind of a deceiver. Because there's never this is what these Tibetans teach, and as I began to think back about Christian spirituality and biblical insight, it's a biblical perspective. You're not ever alone. So we have to think, well, what's going on when we start going to the idea, through the ego position of feeling alone all the time? So and I don't have time to talk about this now, I'm just going to lift them up. What I've been saying to you is, there are all these ego psychologies. There are all these ego theologies. There are these ego spiritualities that seek to teach you and have you become expert, but often without learning to practice the presence. They're very intellectually sophisticated, all sorts of great theology and so on, but there's not any opening to the practicing the presence. Why would an ego want to not be aware of the great companion in the psyche? Think about that just a minute. Why would our ego want to go there? if it's not true, why would the ego go there? You can think about this in terms of what I've come to call the great refusal. The way in which our egos, at a lot of the time, seem to want to refuse awareness of the presence. That's a mystery. Ron was talking about mysteries. There's a mystery there. Why does the ego close up? Shut it out. Decide to walk alone, to be alone and lonely, and fantasize oneself being lonely in the psyche. Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian, used to talk about what he called the mystery of iniquity. The mystery of iniquity. Why would anybody shut themselves off from a gracious God? He said that's a mystery. It's a psychological mystery. We talked about that last night. Why does the ego want to shut out the archetypal self? But even more centrally, in our spiritual life, why would we kind of sometimes prefer darkness? It's really weird. I was blessed, many years ago. You know how these faculties, one of your professors was telling me a while ago that he got drafted to teach this course, and he stepped up. Well, many years ago, my graduate school turned to me, and it's weird, the psychoanalyst on the faculty, and they turn to me and they say, "We want you to teach the advanced courses in Paul Tillich." "Oh, yeah?" I said. "Oh, yeah." So that's what they wanted me to do. So I started to do that. I started to teach the advanced seminars in Tillich. One of the greatest things that ever happened to me. My wife, Margaret, used to be amused. I'd come home from teaching that seminar. Well, what was we doing in the seminar? We were just spending a lot of time with the mind of Paul Tillich, probably the greatest. I know he was the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century, and some Roman Catholic scholars think he's right there up there with in Catholic perspective in terms of insight. So I'd come home and I would have more energy than when I started. I was taught some things about Tillich when I was a really young guy. I discovered that all the things I had been taught really didn't seem to be the real Tillich at all. You may have even heard Tillich was considered to be a secularist, a rationalist, a rational reductionist who really wasn't religious at all. That's what the rap was. Turns out, you get into Tillich, as I was privileged to do, and it turns out he's a theologian of ecstasy. He believes, sort of like those Tibetan Buddhists, he believes you're sitting right now in the flow of the incredible fountain of being. You're sitting right now. In fact, you're actually issuing out of the fountain of the power of being. And everything that is in you is pouring forth from this radiant being that he called the ground of being. So, turns out, Tillich was kind of a theologian of the spirit with a capital S, a kind of a really, really interesting purveyor of Pentecost. Now I'm going to cut now to some of the things that have been kind of shown to me in the last probably a year, about 10 key steps on the diamond path. I'm just going to hit them lightly, and we can talk about them in our discussion later. First step, cutting through your denial, hitting bottom, recognizing your real situation, recognizing your longing, realizing what its true nature is, admitting the feeling of the lack, L-A-C-K, the lack, is dominating in your emotional life. This is the territory of the far country, the territory of the prodigal son. So you cut through denial first, and then you have to come to attention. That's number 2. You have to come to attention. And when he came to himself, awakening, acknowledging the great other, learning to really pay attention to the presence of the great other. And as Rumi says, turning to the road home. Turning to the road home. Number 3 step on this path. Developing right intention. Meaning serious intention, not lukewarm intention. You could say, we'd say it today, we would say, you got to get all in. You got to get all in, both feet in. You got to eliminate your wobble. You got to get out of the middle. You got to leave the despair of indecision. You got to stop what Adler called the hesitating attitude. You got to get in with both feet. That's what commitment is. And the spiritual path, if you're serious about it, requires both feet. Both feet in it. Number 4. Gaining some understanding, you might call it some wisdom, but gaining understanding about how these things work. I would say, following Jung and alchemy, there are 4 elements. And if you're going to create an inner temple, you're going to have to practice holding them in creative tension. That creative tension alone, that is the only thing that actually forms that cup I showed you on the diagram. It constructs the inner temple, the alchemical vessel, the holy grail within, the real chalice of the Eucharist. Balancing the opposites, making possible the 5th element. What's the 5th element? It's the capstone. And what's the capstone? It's practicing the presence consciously, continually. Number 5, you gotta stop being outside the gates. You gotta seek to enter what these Tibetan Buddhists call enter the radiance. You've got to get conscious in your mind that you're surrounded by this transformative energy field already. You don't have to create it. It's already there. You're welcome already to the banquet of abundance in your spiritual life. You're welcome already. In fact, at your deepest place, you're already there. To show your seriousness, you need to make offerings. we might say, you need to bring some of your fish and some of your bread to share with others in your banquet. You're getting very close now to being able to move to the place that you probably already dwell in reality, but you've got to learn how to dwell there consciously. Kind of realize you're already there. The word dwelling. If I had one word, or I would want two words to say the most important thing. The capacity to dwell. These Tibetan Buddhists say to abide. They say always, I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. That's the teaching. The scriptures. I take refuge in the Sangha. That's your community of faith. You take refuge there. The idea is to dwell there. David the king, Rod's been talking about, he taught that he sought to dwell in the house of the Lord all the time. It's become clear to me that dwelling in the house of the Lord is our parallel to taking refuge in the Buddha. So the state you can legitimately aspire to, see, you already dwell in the house of the Lord. See, you're already dwelling there, but you may not be awake to that reality. And your spiritual challenge is to stay awake and accept that all the time, if you can. So, opening to this fellowship of the dragon, who is it that are members of that real fellowship of the dragon? That's the people that are practicing the presence. In fact, who knows who that is? Only the great It. The only way one can come into a membership in that fellowship is through total authenticity. You cannot sneak your way into that. You cannot kind of lie your way into it. It's like the only way to gain entry into that is to really have that relationship with the big It on an ongoing basis. That's who those who do that. Those are the ones that actually participate in that. And I'll say, who knows? Only the true God knows. But that may not be quite right if you think back about the experience of Jesus. Because before the disciples knew who Jesus was, the unhappy spirits knew. The unhappy spirits recognized who he was long before the disciples did. So I suspect the unhappy spirits, Jung called them spirit complexes, archetypal spirit complexes. They weren't personal complexes, but they exist in your psyche. He said those are what we used to call demons. And Tibetan Buddhists think that they're all around. And they call them hungry ghosts. Hungry ghosts. Or the hell beings. But their attitude toward them, and this is important for us as Christians, their attitude toward them is that they wish them blessing and healing and peace. And the great Bodhisattva, who is the Christ figure, for these Buddhists. The great bodhisattva of compassion will never leave the realm of time as long as there's one suffering, hungry ghost, one being dwelling in hell. The great bodhisattva of compassion will never go to nirvana as long as one being is suffering. Who does that sound like? Who does that sound like? Karl Barth believed that was Christ. And Karl Barth believed that the grace of God is so powerful that in spite of those who would love to believe that some of these folks are damned and go to hell forever, Karl Barth believed, no. Christ is going to keep at it until they get redeemed too. Sounds very much like these folks. All right, now I want to finish this up right quick, and then we can talk. A lot of us got the question now, is there any realistic hope for our suffering world, or should we just curl up in the snowbank of resignation and despair for a little nap? Think about that a minute, Let's just, we're kind of tired, we're fatigued, we're burned out, we got compassion fatigue. Maybe we should just kind of curl up in the snowbank, rest a little bit. Because it doesn't look like it's very hopeful. Jung was asked, is there any hope? He believed there was a slim reason for hope, just a slim one. He said, it's possible that there might be a vanguard of folks committed to relating consciously to the archetypal self, to the great it. And that if there were enough of those folks who really, authentically were doing what I say, loving the dragon, if there were enough people, we might say a remnant, who were actually loving the dragon, Jung thought that there might be some contagion that would break out of humility, and that it might spread like wildfire, and that it might turn the tide. He thought that's the only chance for us. He saw the gathering storm and knew at the end of the life that the prognosis, as we say, is guarded. But these Tibetan Buddhists, they believe there already exists that vanguard. They believe that there's already a vanguard of those who dwell in the love of the great other with ecstasy. They are in ecstasy. They passionately and gradually seek to learn to dwell in the bliss and radiance of that awareness being. And they believe that possibility of stepping in to satori or samadhi or liberation is always and everywhere forever represented to us as an existential possibility in every moment. Think about that. Who does that sound like? So there is this living Lord of the dance, who is that fundamental enlightened reality of the Most High, who is above every name. And according to these Tibetan Buddhists of the Dzogchen tradition, you know the ones who are enlightened because of the powerful compassion that flows constantly from their presence all the time. That's how you know enlightenment. It always rises simultaneously with compassion. So you gotta care for that fellowship, and I don't have time to talk about that right now. You got to care for it. You got to tend it. You got to tend the garden of that. This is not a deistic point of view. You know, the watchmaker God that makes the watch and sets it on its own. It's not a theistic point of view. It's not a God that creates the world and still kind of keeps in touch by telegraph. This is a panentheistic God. And this panentheistic God, actually, like Tillich said, and like Alfred North Whitehead believed, it dwells constantly, present, powerfully in every puff of matter and being in all the universes. So what does Christianity have that the Buddhists sometimes struggle with? Well, the Buddhists think you really kind of want to see the world as an illusion. And the real idea is to kind of escape from the world of samsara. But Christians believe that the Christ event revealed that history on earth is the dwelling of the body and blood of God, and that you cannot set the goal of escaping from history and all its suffering. You got to recognize God in history and live the compassion in history. So anyway, if I had time, I would tell you about this really wild, radical Catholic death of God theologian, Thomas J.J. Altizer. He actually really believes that the transformation of history has already occurred, and that if we were fully awake, you would be living in the bliss of the radical presence of Christ. Sounds like those Buddhists to me. Sounds like those Buddhists. So I'm out of time here, but the diamond path that is really possible for us is to really wake up that you're living in the radiance now. You're living in the big love now. You're living in the powerful, indestructible compassion now. And when your ego's feeling lonely, you just got to try to keep your sense of humor. Because when your ego's feeling lonely, you have been tricked by the trickster ego. And you got to laugh so that you can be liberated from that spell. I'm going to stop right there. Let's take about 10 minutes and then come back, and I'm going to field questions for as long as Rose will let me. We better get started. I want to just invite you. You know, we've talked about a lot of things in the last 3 nights, and I know I've raised a lot more questions than I have provided any answers to. And there are lots of very, very great questions I'm sure you have. And so I just want to open it. Do we have our microphones? Yes. Rose is out there rounding up the doggies. All right, so say your name, sir, and
you were speaking of the diagram last night, the ego, the id, and the chalice.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a minute ago about the 5 loaves and fishes, and maybe the Last Supper and the chalice. Could you kind of tie that together for me?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, you know, I started looking about the transformation symbolism in the Mass years and years ago when I was studying Jung's writings on this. Increasingly over the years, it's become clear to me that that the Eucharistic symbolism and ritual action is sort of an amazing ritualization of acting out of the truth about all this stuff. So that cup of blessing, you know, that image of that, you know, you can think it's the Holy Grail, the Grail cup, the chalice that the priest offers for the people in the Mass. If you look at all that stuff esoterically, it's all referring to the same reality. You know, I started out this thinking about, the reason I got to thinking, you know, they had this movie came out about Noah, and it was kind of, I thought it was kind of synchronistic given the flood that we're in. And I began to kind of think a lot about the symbolism of the ark as vessel and container. And it became clear to me that actually having a functioning vessel of transformation is one of the big keys. That's the big key. It's like Ron was talking about, is if you have all this God, and based on what I've been saying tonight, you're dwelling in the power of God all the time, see. And if you don't have that very, very indestructible vessel, then it can just make you real crazy. And a lot of people get fried in it, and they do become psychotic. They do become psychotic. Ron really gave a great summary about that. So I think that's what you're getting at. It's like, what can I say about that? It's just that all of the symbolism of all this stuff just sort of intersects in that chalice. If you got the chalice, it has to be an actual inner reality, though. You know, we got the cup out here, but that's a symbol of the need, the necessity for an inner cup of offering. See, so I suspect you know more about that than I do. I just, in my old age, I'm just really clear about how central that is. If you're going to dwell, these Tibetan Buddhists, they just say, abide. They say, I abide. I abide. And you don't know who's talking, whether it's the human or whether it's the Buddha nature. But it is true. I abide. And what we're talking about tonight, abide consciously. You already abide. You don't have to try to create that by becoming an expert meditator. You just have to open to the reality that you are abiding now. And you probably have been abiding from before the foundations of the universe. But getting awake is hard. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Say your name, sir.
I'm going to throw you another hand grenade.
All right.
Only I'm going to pull the pin this time.
Just throw it at my head.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question of everyone in here first before I say what I'm going to say. How many people in here have read the Quran? Raise your hands.
Read what?
The Quran.
Quran.
Okay. Have you read the chapter?
Is this a pop quiz?
Yes, it is. Have you read the chapter on woman and the chapter on table? And is the Quran that you have read from a foreign country, or is it one printed in the United States? These are the things that I like to ask for the people who have read one. I suggest for everyone in here to pick up a Quran, read it and understand it, one from a foreign country. And then my question is this: how do we...
You have a point, obviously.
Yes, how do we change the minds of Muslims to become Christians? Because if we don't, we're going to have problems. The chapter on woman and the chapter on table specifically says how to deal with a Christian or a Jew. And I think that everyone should be aware of this. And if we don't convert these people, we're going to be the ones who suffer. This is my opinion.
Well,
and so anyway...
We hear your opinion.
Okay, thank you.
We hear it.
But
and let me just say that, you know, there's this principle in Bowen systems theory that applies in this situation. If you want somebody else to get less full of hate and be less chaotic and less aggressive, the most powerful thing you can do is to go into peace yourself. And if you're too anxious about that, that is something to be worked on. Because Jesus said, be not anxious. Be not anxious. And I know when all of the forces are invading Iraq and Baghdad as we speak, I know that that's a big source of anxiety. But I don't want to go down that path tonight. Yes?
Hi. This is not formulated very well, but...
Take your time.
This is where I'm going. If we, in the spirit of individualism that we have in today's society, the U.S., we really emphasize about going within, which I agree is so very important. Would people find themselves more into their own relationship, God and me, rather than the community of going to church on Sunday in that community? That was one question I had within my head. If we really emphasized one more than the other or something. And the other, I thought, you know, we go in front of the Eucharist as Catholics for adoration, and we kind of project the presence of God there.
Right.
And then we say, no, God is here. And I'm wondering if we have a disconnect somehow.
A disconnect?
A disconnect when we say, God's presence is there. No, God is here.
Well, we all got a disconnect, don't we?
I don't know.
But see, you know, we're always projecting God, and it's an idealizing projection, and it's what we call in psychoanalysis an idealizing transference. So we put our sense of the gold or the divine out here, but there's nothing, you know, that's what we humans do. I've written before that if you're going to discover the gold inside your heart, you're very likely going to have to project it on somebody out here and let them carry it for a while until there's this arcing, this flow of energy that goes between, I see you as the gold, I see you as the Holy One, I see you as the one that's the bearer of the divine child. And then gradually, because you let me relate to you, and you let me put you on a pedestal, then there can be a kind of an energy arc. And gradually I might start to wake up to the gold that's in my heart. See? And so that's an eternal flow there. You know, in this world, what we know now from quantum mechanics, you can't be disconnected. It's impossible at the most fundamental level to be disconnected. We all dwell in this radiant energy field. And a lot of the most recent unpublished scientific research is talking something really weird. It's really kind of wild, because there's more and more evidence that not only is matter conscious, but energy is conscious. And you are not separate. You're not disconnected. You're in the flow. So, our ego is going to tell us that we're disconnected. Keep a sense of humor. All the evidence now says you're in the flow. You're not disconnected. And that trickster ego may kind of want you to feel disconnected and be anxious, but it's not true. So, anyway, I know I have a sense of how confusing a lot of this stuff is, and I want to have time to ask Ron about all this. That was a magnificent lecture this morning. I mean, he answered all kinds of questions that I didn't even have. Who else has got a question they want to put on the table? Yes. What?
I kind of wanted to ask a question about something you had mentioned about the indestructible diamond core or center.
Yeah.
Resting behind our ego that may sometimes be our flawed ego.
Always.
Always. Right. What is it that limits us from going through that flawed ego? And can you expound on that just a bit? Is it limitations of past trauma? Is it limitations of grandiosity? Thank you.
All of the above. All of the above. It's a multidimensional mystery. Mystery of iniquity. Why do we dwell in the health space of horrible anxiety? I've realized recently, it's kind of shameful for me to say that, but I've realized fairly recently how much of my life I spent in horrific anxiety. Horrific anxiety. And, hold a gun at my head and say, explain why that was. You just have to shoot me. I couldn't explain that to you, but I know it's been true. It is a mystery, see, but it isn't the final mystery. So, you could probably, if you just sit down and relax and think about it, you could probably give us a lecture about that and why, I suspect. Let's see. What do we got? 2 or 3 minutes?
Okay.
Lupe, okay.
Hello. And I was wondering if you could share steps 7 through 10 in the diamond path.
When you invite me back, I'll go through those in more detail. I'm sorry that went so fast because Rose was waving at me, And I didn't want her to get her hook. And yank me off the stage. And but I don't really have time tonight, but I can just say that it's quite clear that there is it's like that diagram, that 7-stage diagram. You got to wake up to the presence of the great other first. Because if you're asleep and in the far country, you got to come to before you can go home. And so it's that whole stepping from realizing that you got to wake up. It's a long way home. What are the chances I'm going to get there? Well, if you're too kind of loosey-goosey, they're not good. And so there's one thing I didn't get a chance to talk about, but it's fierceness. Fierceness. Holy fierceness. Holy fierceness. Because if this walk in this diamond path, if that's important, and it's eternally important, then it deserves both feet in it. Past the wobble, fierce commitment to your creative unfolding of your selfhood and your capacity to dwell. A lot of folks think that there's this, that love never goes with power. But that is a lie. Because our calling is to stand clearly in the big love, which is this indestructible, powerful compassion. It is not weak. And, folks that kind of they think about Jesus as the victim. I don't think they get it about what his work was. What was his work? Well, it wasn't about being masochistic and being a victim. It was an act of primordial liberation of history. And I don't have time to get into that now, but I have had a good time, and I just got to mention, I've had a good time studying the latest work of Thomas J.J. Altizer, who I was told when I was young was a sort of a terrible atheistic, a death of God person. Turns out that nothing could be further from the truth. He was a radical, he is, I think he's still alive, he is a radical Catholic. And what we've been talking about, who is radical about realized eschatology. The eschaton, the second coming, has already happened. And the world, just like you sit in the power and the radiant power of being, history has already been redeemed. What's going on? Well, there's a lot of unhappy spirits that are fomenting a lot of chaos in the world, in my personality, in the world, in all sorts of forms. Jung talked about them as spirit complexes. Positive spirit complexes, angels. Negative spirit complexes, we used to call them demons. Buddhists call them hungry ghosts or hell beings. And you could just think about it a little bit this way. There are a lot of nervous hell beings now. You can tell. You can tell that there are a lot of really, really nervous, anxious spirit complexes. You got a flood of anxiety around. Who's anxious and why would they be anxious? Well, put your Christian hat on, think a little bit about realized eschatology. And if Thomas J.J. Altizer is right, these unhappy spirits, these hungry ghosts, they're trying to maintain their denial. Think about that now, man. They're seeking to maintain not knowing that something has changed. Now, at your deepest heart of hearts, you know something has changed. Think about that. you know something has changed. The Lord of history is with us now, already in power. In power. And so, it's not time to be in despair. I have no despair whatsoever. I have no despair. If you, deep down in you, you don't either. In your deeper parts of your soul, you're not in despair. Got to think about that a little bit. One more question or comment back here. Go ahead.
One more question. And my question is, which of the inner selves is the one that's commonly referred to as the shadow self?
Okay. This will be, understanding the structure of the shadow would be one of my lectures when I come back. It's a really interesting question because the truth is the shadow is your shadow depends on how you have incarnated the different archetypal energies, the particular configuration. If you look in that booklet I gave you, I have delineated 16 configurations of archetypal energies for males and 16 configurations for women. And your shadow depends on what you left out when you were building your Mayan pyramid. And all of us in here, I mean, you're talking about your inner Mayan pyramid, you know, the sacred mountain, what the Buddhists call Mount Meru. They think that your spine is Mount Meru, center of the universe. And we all have to build that. You got to build that vessel. It doesn't come with the territory. You got to build it block by block. And see, you can't start everywhere. You know, you started building your temple from one side of those archetypal systems, and I probably started from another. We want to all get to the same place. We want to be able to get... Have you ever been to Chichen Itza? How many have been to Chichen Itza? You know that temple up on top of that pyramid? That's, in my view, that's the best symbol there is about where the human meets the divine and sits down in a colloquy. Right up there in that temple on top of that. So that's a long discussion. But if I had a little time with you, we could figure out fairly quick how your shadow would be shaped. And remember, the shadow is not all negative. In fact, a lot of us, we didn't get blessed very much. You know, Ron's brilliant, talking about the need for blessing. And whatever good thing about you didn't get blessed, it splits off into the unconscious. And that's your shadow. So your shadow may be all kinds of wonderful things that your family just refused to see in you. See? So that's there's a lot of lectures available on that. So that's our last question. I wish there was time for more. I want to thank you again for this opportunity to be with you. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you.